that's how Marist Education began. That story, some would know that little extract from Ludovic's diary, but we often focus on that and you know, the boys and the Zell boys, the situation they have. We don't always focus on the men themselves. Let's pause on these guys. Ludovic was 28. 28 years of age, been chosen to lead this thing on the other side of the world. Like going to the moon. And he was French, never been to a Marist school. He joined the Marist because he saw a pamphlet in the church that promised overseas postings or missionary experience. He was generally attracted to it, and so he joined in France, and then he went to England. He spent some time in three schools in Great Britain and Ireland. Began teaching in. We had a school at St Patrick's in Soho. We don't have any schools in London anymore, but Soho was a really good place to have a school. We also had a school in Leicester Square, of all places. You know, we gave that up. He taught there. He taught in Sligo in Ireland, taught in Dundee in Scotland, and learned his English. And a very good man. Jarlath was 25 years old. He was Irish. He'd been teaching for a few years. He was finally professed, like Ludovic. Don't have a photo of him. Do have a photo of this guy, Augustine. That's a photo of him in older life. But at the time he was 21. He's only very young. Augustine MacDonald. He was a Scot, and he was a fiery Scot. He was a crisp, acerbic, opinionated Scotsman, young. Because he was 21, he knew everything, as 21-year-olds tend to. I've just had 5 years in a university college. I'm used to dealing with 21-year-olds. And the fourth guy was a guy by the name of Peter Tennyson. He was also Irish. He was, though he was 25, he was just finished his novitiate. He'd been in the Papal Army in Italy, fighting the Garibaldi and the others trying to unify Italy on the side of the Pope, lost. Anyway, he came back and joined the brothers, so fairly fresh. What happened? Well, first of all, Augustine. Augustine developed a fairly bad bout of rheumatic fever. His way of dealing with that was self-medication, in other words, he took to the bottle. And didn't deal with it so well. It became a problem. Ludovic's got these agonising things in his journal of having to drag him out of the pub. And he wanted to go home. Ludovic saw something in him, he prevailed upon him to stay, and he said, well, how about we have another go? How about you go to New Caledonia, where the brothers had also just started, you know? And so in 1873, the next year, Augustine's gone. Then Jarlath, he was pretty discontent too. He wanted to go back home. He wasn't really getting into it so well. He was struggling in the classroom, and so Ludovic said, "Okay, go back to Europe." He did. He left the brothers, which leaves Peter. Peter's only been a brother for 5 minutes, sort of thing. He found other interests, particularly among the young women of the parish. Irish. Some of the colleagues, I don't know, it's not detailed in the journals, but we think. Anyway, Ludovic dismissed him. He's gone. So the poor man's on his own. It's not going well. One guy who comes to join him is his brother Marie Nissier. This is a picture of him as a young man, but he'd come out in the 1830s. Marsland had sent him out. 1836, he was with Peter Chanel when Peter Chanel was killed on the island of Fortuna. He was now an older man. He was only in his 50s, but an old 57, I think, 56 at this year. And he came to join the community as their cook, but he was good company and a great man, but no help in school. And another Frenchman by the name of Ange Frères, who was a good teacher, became first principal the foundation principal at Parramatta, actually. But he was 3 or 4 years later, he died, sadly, as a young man. It wasn't ideal. And I'm reminded of this comment of a French brother a few years later when Marcelin's cause to be a saint was introduced in 1888. They asked some of the brothers who knew Marcelin, when they were younger, they're now old men, but one of the guys was Brother Theodos, and he said this at the time, in the second year of the inquiry, 1889. He said, "The first brothers whom Father Champagne received into the novitiate had little more than goodwill and courage. Their religious instruction was incomplete. They barely knew how to read and write. They knew almost nothing of good manners. Their rusticity matched the rugged mountains where they were born. It's hard to believe their rapid transformation, thanks to Father Champagne. In a few years, their lives proved that they'd become good religious, and the high regard in which their schools were held proved that they were capable educators." My point simply is this, that it's rare, if not ever, do we have the ideal resource base, whether it's human resources or physical resources or the ideal people to run the school. Ludovic didn't, Marcelin didn't, and we're never going to have that. But it's us, as it was them, who were called to do this Marist thing, as we are. And it's not and to embrace who we are. Just park that idea, we'll come back to it. What I'd like to do this afternoon is I wrote something, some of you might have seen this, I wrote something last year on Marist Education. And I'm just going to cherry pick. We could spend a whole semester, if not a year, on Marist Education, and it's where it came from and what its characteristics are and all of that, what it is. But I just want to take a few little things, a few tasters, if you like. Marcelin, as us today, faced what I call 5 basic questions in determining what is Marist Education, what's it to be, what's it to look like, how do we know how can we be confident we have a good Marist school? Questions are these: who should be educated? Who should be in our schools? Who should we be spending our time with? Why? What's our purpose? What are we doing? What should they be taught? How? And by whom? And in structuring this little booklet, I devote a chapter to each of those questions. I'd just like to tap into each of them briefly. First of all, who? Well, an important thing to recognise is that when Marcelin started our Marist educational movement, it wasn't just a country priest trying to do a good thing and, let's get a few goodwill young men as teachers and we'll do what we best. We'll do something for these kids here. No. Education was a hot topic. It was a hot topic in France. There were books written on it. There had been for a couple of 100 years. This is an example of one of them. It's called the parish school. In Old French, they had an S there. École is, some would know, école is the French word for school. For us, the parish school, or the way of properly instructing children in the petite école, in the little schools, the petite école. There was, from the time of Louis XIV in 1600s, something that we now call the petite école movement, the little school movement. Louis XIV made it compulsory that every parish, right through the Kingdom of France, would have a school, a parish school. Didn't give them any money to do it, so it was a bit patchy how it was rolled out. But out of that, and France led Europe in this, led the world really in this, in terms of universal education. But out of that grew a whole literature about what these little schools should be. Essentially from the big abbey schools, the big monastery schools, little schools for the average kids, the ordinary people. And the sense was that they were for everyone. Who should be in these schools? Everyone. But we, in Australia today, we need to understand how different France was at the time. In the year 1800, 87% of French families lived in rural, remote areas, not in towns and cities. 87%. Only 13% lived in cities or large towns. So we talk about Marcelin and Marcelin wanting to found schools for the rural kids, for the kids of the countryside. That's most kids. That's the mainstream. It's not the few on the margins. And this movement, its ideal was that everyone would be in these schools. But there were some qualifications to that. For example, in this book, which was a handbook on the little school, on the petite école, there were separate benches. So the kids who had more money sat on this bench, and the kids who were poorer sat on that bench. Why? Because of their grime, their smell, and their lice. And the schools that Marcelin started were different from that. And I'd like to look at the difference between these petite écoles, the tradition, and Marcelin's take on it. What was different for Marcelin? What was different for Marcelin was that there were no divisions. There were no divisions in the schoolroom between rich and poor, between the haves and the have-nots. It was inclusive. Totally inclusive. Same dignity for everyone. The same possibility, the same belief in everyone. And I'll take this a little bit further in the why. In the petite école movement, what were they doing? Well, they had two goals. They had a catechetical goal. They wanted, students to learn to love God, to know their catechism, to practice their religion. And they had a civic goal. They wanted them to read. And for the more able students to write. At the time, writing was regarded as a superior skill. Not everyone could master that, they thought, but everyone could learn to read. So the better students, only the better students would learn to write. And some basic knowledge about things. The purpose being so that they could fulfill their station in life. There was nothing radical about this. There was nothing socially revolutionary about this. It was just so people could be live good human lives. But if they were a baker, they were going to be a baker. If they were a peasant, they were going to be a peasant. There was no sense that I can be anything. That wasn't part of it at all. And even probably one of the greatest educational movements in the history of the world in some ways, started by Jean-Baptiste de La Salle. In the De La Salle schools, it was a similar thing. There was a sense that we are educating these children to be good at whatever their level is, whatever their station in life is. And Marcelin didn't buy that. That didn't sit with him. We know the expression good Christians and good citizens. He thought all students could be good Christians. That was hardly nothing out of the box there. But this word, yeah, that's interesting. The word citizen, citoyen in French, it was an edgy word. It was a revolutionary word. If you remember in the French Revolution, when the French Revolution in 1789, they had this thing called the Declaration on the Rights of Man. Sorry for the non-inclusive language. But this document, Declaration on the Rights of Man, it says Declaration on the Rights of Man, it's in French, and of the citoyen, and of the citizen. This was a word of the Revolution. Before the Revolution, there were no citizens, there were subjects. We're all subjects of the king. But now we're citizens. And as the Revolution went sour, and then Napoleon came and that went south, by the time Marcelin comes to found his schools, king's back on the throne, church is back in the ascendancy, and a word like citizen was a very leftish word. It was not kosher in church circles to talk about citizens. It was this new thinking, this secular thinking, and Marcelin said no. And he used the word good citizen, in French, bon citoyen, good citizen. Sometimes it's mistranslated in our book on Marist Education, in the footsteps, as virtuous citizen. Marcelin never said virtuous citizen, he said good citizen. It's a different sense. What is a good citizen? And you know, in a Marist school today, what is a good citizen? What is a good global citizen? What is a good Australian citizen? It's an instruction for us. What are we doing? I'm just rushing through a few things here because we'll have a lot of time. Third thing, what should be taught? Well, all of us, most of us here, have had curriculum discussions, you know. Curriculum's often a hot topic. And it was then too. So, you know, we looked at, in the Petite École, we looked at that other book a minute ago. There are other books written. The De La Salles in the beginning of the 1700s put out this book, The Conduct of Christian Schools. Excellent manual on what one of these Petite Écoles look like. And Marcelin said, that'll do us, we'll copy that. Actually, he didn't, but initially he did. But it was very detailed on what should be taught, how it should be taught, and all that sort of thing. In his own diocese in Lyon, rules for the schools of the city and the diocese of Lyon by a fellow by the name of Demier. It doesn't matter, the name doesn't matter. But it came from the same time as De La Salle, about 100 years before, and it was very detailed. What should be taught in schools and so on. After Marcelin started the schools, an important law was passed in 1833, and this was published for France. This document, it's called the Guide of the Primary School Guide, and it talks about what has to be done in primary schools after the law of 1833, which was we don't need to go into detail, but a very significant law was passed in 1833, which really detailed what was taught in school. So, like today, there's lots of external documents. There are lots of curriculum documents that are imposed upon us. You will teach this, and you will teach that, and you will teach that, and you will give so many hours to that, and so many hours to that, and so many hours to something else. That hasn't changed. So for a lot of what happened, a lot of the what in Marist schools was a given. So let's look at, well, what was different for Marcelin in this what? If the what was the same, what was his difference? The difference was a difference of emphasis and a difference of orientation. So, for example, rather than teaching children to say their prayers, he wanted to give them a taste for it, a love of it. The whole Marist approach right from the beginning was very affective, very much with the heart. Another thing that was important for Muslim, and I think it's important for us to know this as teachers, is that Muslim was very keen on outcomes. He was very keen on effective teaching. If I were to ask you what makes your school Marist, you might say, "Oh, yeah, we have a great spirit, and everyone good relationships, and the teacher-student relationship is at the heart of what we do, and we make policies are informed by Marist things, and we have a good solidarity program. We do liturgy well." And Muslim would be saying, "But are you teaching well? Are you teaching well?" And the great example for me of this is to do with reading. Muslim had an interrupted education himself as a boy. I mean, we sometimes think he wasn't well educated. He was very well educated for his time. He went to the minor seminary, which is like the high school. He went to the major seminary, which is like university. So he's effectively a university-educated person. Trilingual. He had his native language. He had to learn French. He had to learn Latin. He was a pretty educated man at the end. But he struggled initially to learn to read. In the late 1820s, when he was starting to set up these schools, he was keen to get to the bottom of this. Why? He asked, why did I struggle to learn to read? And so he made it a personal project to find out some answers to that. And he looked around at reading methods. He looked at the theories. He looked at the practice. And he wanted his schools to be really good at doing this for all the kids. So, what came out of it eventually was this book, which you might never have seen before. It's in French. New Principles of Reading for the use of the Brothers of Mary of Christian Instruction, 3rd edition, Notre Dame de l'Hermitage, Our Lady of the Hermitage, 1844. What they developed was, the 1st edition was in 1836. What they developed was a reader. And the argument was, no different from what it is today, do we use phonics or do we use a sight method, And he said, no, we use phonics. That's going to be what works. Doesn't matter, you probably may have opinions about this if you're a primary school teacher, but the point is that it wanted it to be effective. And this book kept, but based on practice, they kept refining it, they kept changing it. Between then and the year 1914, when it was published for the last time, there were 45 different editions of this. They kept updating it, they kept changing it, they kept improving it, based on what we would call today action research, just on the feedback, what was working in the classrooms. I think it's a great window into a very important part of Marist education, that it's good teaching, measured by good outcomes. And they had competitions. They had league tables. They published the results of the schools, and who was doing best and all. It was no apology for it. How should they be taught? 4th question. We'll pause after this. Let's look at this quotation from Muslim. He asked this. This is from a book called A Vie sans Sentence, which was published after his death. Marcel is quoted as saying this: why does a teacher decide to take care of the weak students in his class? Pardon the non-inclusive language. Weak students in his class as well as the strong ones, and to give them even more attention precisely because they are weak, and to act so that without slowing too much the progress of the better students, he does not leave behind any of those poor children who give him so little satisfaction, or give so little satisfaction to his self-esteem. Why does he do this? He says, well, to do that, it definitely demands a fatherly and motherly devotedness. Words are important. Or paternal, maternal devotedness. Because only fathers and mothers never leave their little children behind. They pace themselves to their weakness. They wait for them, if need be, and they never sacrifice some for the sake of the others, saying, as did Jacob, I cannot walk so quickly, you know I have little children. He goes on, only devotedness can patiently put up with their weaknesses, the heartbreaking missteps, the ingratitude of children. Only devotedness can eventually endear the teacher to them, attract them, lift them up. Only devotedness transforms them as a father, as would a father or a mother. Transforms a big word. In a word, only devotedness can carry out properly the task of education. Then the punchline. But one devotes, you're only devoted because one loves. So love is the foundation of education. A father's love or a mother's love. What we touch on here, I would argue, is the most original idea that Marcel ever came up with. With the reading I was talking about, he copied best practice. Other words that we throw around, like presence and simplicity, he picks those from Francis de Sales. A lot of his teaching method he pinched from the De La Salles. Something that was absolutely original, and I can't find anywhere in the literature of the time where this term is used, is family spirit. That seems to be a completely original thought of Master, but his intuition. In that book I was quoting earlier, The Parish School, it does talk about the master. It's the term it uses. The master being like the father of a family. That's as close as I can find, but doesn't use the word family spirit. Later on, the Salesians used it and still use it, I think, but that came decades and decades later. This seems to be an original thought of Marcel. It provides us with a very profound root metaphor for our schools. One that I know we plumb deeply, and we should, because it goes to some of the essence of Marcel's intuition, you know. Because a family, of course, you know, as we all know, a good family is sourced in love and is bound by love, is directed to love. Love's where it comes from, and love is where it leads to. Okay, let's pause there before we go on to the last one and just have a little buzz at the tables, and anything that strikes you out of that. Just twos and threes, and we'll pick up in a minute. The last question is, who's doing it? I referred to that law of 1833, and after 1833, so just at the relatively early years of the Marist movement, there's a law passed in France that says all teachers need to be professionally trained. They call it a brevet, like a teacher's certificate, and they need to be a good character. So that was the given. No problem with that. But where is where is Marsland going to be different from that? Well, I think we find it best, we find it strongly in our education document, now 25 years old. Well, there's a group working on a revision of this at the moment. I hope they do a good job, because I've got a few problems with this document. But basically, it's an excellent document. At the start of it, it has this charter, and it talks about, disciples of Muslims, companion brothers and lay people together, and blah blah blah. And each of these lines becomes a chapter of the book. The most important word in that charter, I think, is hiding there in plain sight. It's this word, we. The whole book is written in the first person. It doesn't present a theory of education. It doesn't present a set of pedagogical principles. It has all that. It's implied, at least. But it talks right through about we. And Marsland's difference, I think, is that he formed people who were Marist in their heart, in their heads too, in their hands. So people have heard me speak before, would have heard me say this. What is a simple definition of Marist education for me? Marist education is what Marists do in education. And why they do it, how they do it, for whom they do it, and with whom they do it. It all pivots on their being Marists. It doesn't start with a theory. It doesn't start with a textbook. It starts with people. It starts and ends with people. People who are Marists. And if we have Marist, we have Marist education. Simple as that. I don't say that tritely. I think that's quite profound. That's a quite deep thing that I just invite you to sit with. And the reverse of that, if we don't have Marists, we won't have Marist education. We won't have Marist schools. And what do I mean by Marist? Well, I mean, first of all, in our professional practice, we'll be Marist, and we'll be able to speak about it. We'll be able to talk about we do this. This is in our policy. This is a priority. We give time to this. We give time to that. Why? Because it's a Marist way, and we talk about that comfortably. We can articulate it. And it sits well with us. I'm happy in this school. I feel like I can be the professional educator I want to be. The style suits me. The style is my style. The way we relate to young people, the priorities we give, the approach we take, the values we extol, the things we don't put up with. All of that professional stuff can be Marist. So professionally we're Marist, ministerially, in our ministry. Some of the stuff we were talking about earlier at the beginning of our gathering today, spiritually or personally, it sits well with me. This Marian way, this Marian openness, this Marian generosity, this Marian joy, all of the whole Marian spirituality, that sits well with me. The Marsland story sits well with me, sits comfortably with me. I can identify with someone like that. If that's what being Christian means, yeah, that's I can do that. I like that. That attracts me personally. So I'm personally Marist, and thirdly, I'm communally. I'm part of a group. I identify with like-hearted people, like-minded people who share this way with me together. We I know other people. I don't know everyone in the world who's Marist, but I know some. And together that's who we are. And together we have some responsibility for this. We have some responsibility for the tone of our school, the priorities of our school, the practice of our school, how we deal with young people and so on, and what we need for ourselves. Something like this afternoon. What sort of formation do we need? What sort of updates do we need? What sort of resources do we need? What sort of supports do we need? Let's keep developing those. Let's keep writing those. Let's keep exposing ourselves. Gavin mentioned the pilgrimage, which is one of our great things we do out of this country. I just had a meeting this very morning with Tony Clark about next year's pilgrimage, actually. What I want to finish with is really where I started. Who will they be? Looking going into the future, who will they be, these Marists? Who they'll be is us. Think of Ludovic when he came. If he had picked his ideal team, he wouldn't have picked the 3 men he got. If Marsland had picked his ideal starting group, he wouldn't have picked the group. Jesus wouldn't have picked the apostles, You play with the cards you're dealt. It's us. It's us. That's who are called to be Marist in this time and place. It's changing, of course, One of the huge changes of our time is the diminishment of the number of brothers among us. Don't think there are any brothers actively involved in any of your 3 schools, and that's the norm around the country. That's personally sad for me, but that's the reality, And that will change even more dramatically in the next decade. I've just been in Adelaide, but I went to Adelaide 6 years ago. We had 13 brothers in 3 communities. When I left a few months ago, we had 4 brothers in 1 community. That's dramatic. And that change will continue to be dramatic over the next decade. And it's I suppose it's the curious irony of our time, Never have there been fewer brothers, I guess, involved in, but never has Marist Education been so alive in Australia. Never have there been so many schools. Never have there been so many Marists. Never have they been so well professionally prepared and resourced. So that's the irony we live with. But how do we ensure, if it's us, if it's you and me, the people in our school, the people we sit around in the staff room each day, if it's us, how do we ensure our vitality as a Marist group? And how do we ensure our integrity? To be genuine, okay, you're a genuine Marist. How do we ensure those 2 things? Well, ladies and gentlemen, I congratulate you on coming to something like this afternoon. I congratulate those of you that have joined the Marist Association, because that's how we do it. In Australia, in 2022, that's plan A and there's no plan B. This will be the means through which we ensure our vitality and ensure our integrity. Sometimes when I hear people say, what's the Marist Association, or what is it? What does it do? What does it do? What's it do? It does John Terry High School, it does St. College, it does others, lots of other things. That's what it does. What's its purpose? Its basic purpose for me, is it's a space for people, for us, to become a Marist, to deepen as a Marist, and to share responsibility for what's continuing to evolve and develop. Together we'll develop formation programs and documents and policies and structures and community and all the things that need to happen. So I'm just so heartened to come to a gathering like this after a day at school at this stage of term 4, that people are keen just to take their Marist journey a bit further and to be with other people who are interested in doing likewise. Thank you.